James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. About 11 o'clock, Napoleon, with a numerous staff, appeared on the heights immediately opposite to our division. The imperial cortege was no sooner observed by our artillery than they greeted it with a royal salute. At first the French chief seemed to relish the compliment paid him, but conceiving, no doubt, that we were rather troublesome with our manners, he soon turned the head of his horse and rode off. A little after this we were honoured with a visit from the late Duke of Richmond, who had travelled from Brussels that morning to pay his personal respects to the Duke of Wellington. After congratulating the officers present on their miraculous deliverance on the 16th, the Duke informed us that he had just seen our General-in-Chief, who calculated on a glorious victory before evening, Prince Blucher and 35,000 Prussians being on their march to our assistance. The effects which this communication produced on the minds of the soldiers were truly astonishing. Joy beamed on their countenances, and victory during the remainder of the day was never from their view. But it may be fairly doubted whether the speedy prospect of being succoured by the Prussians or the two following verses produced the most powerful effect on the hearts of the Highlanders. These lines, chanted by one of their own number, who altered them to suit the occasion, were received as they ought to be by every inhabitant of these realms when threatened with the vengeance of a foreign despot. At 11:30, Jerome Bonaparte descended the heights on the left of La Belle Alliance at the head of his division and attacked our light troops in the front of Hougoumont. His march was considerably retarded by our artillery, almost the first shot from which killed and wounded several of his men. Having at length arrived in the vicinity of Hougoumont, the French attacked the Guards with great spirit, but for some time gained very little ground. Their assaults, which were made with great impetuosity, were met and repelled by the garrison with the most determined bravery. The foreign troops, originally associated with the British in the defence of this post, having retired, the whole duty devolved upon the Guards, who throughout the day showed that the trust could not have been reposed in better hands. Attack succeeded attack. Round shot, shell, grape shot, and musketry were poured into the place in the greatest profusion, without producing any unfavourable impression on the garrison. Every avenue to the old mansion was contested with an obstinacy seldom equalled. Every tree was contended for as if the prize had been a kingdom. No neutral walls or hedges were permitted. The one party or the other behoved to be absolute possessor. The gates of the chateau and courtyard were assailed by the enemy with a bravery bordering on frenzy, but our troops, having loopholed the walls, fired thence on their fierce antagonists with such fatal effect that not only were they driven back, but the ground around was covered with their dead. For an hour and a half this tragedy was acted at Hougoumont. Enraged at length at the obstinate defence of the gallant Byng and his handful of guards, Napoleon turned his attention to the left wing and centre, with the view of wreaking his vengeance on us for his defeat at the chateau. About 1 o'clock he opened a most tremendous fire upon our division from a numerous artillery planted along the ridge on which his infantry were posted. Under cover of this cannonade, he pushed forward 3 columns of infantry, each from 3,000 to 4,000 strong, towards the heights we occupied. With loud shouts of "Vive l'Empereur!" the left column attacked the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, while the right column, supported by the third, moved against the Belgian troops immediately in front of our brigade. The Belgians, assailed with terrible fury, returned the fire of the enemy for some time with great spirit. But on the approach of the French, they shifted their ground and retired behind the hedge, which, although it afforded them no shelter from the enemy's fire, yet concealed them from their view. Here, On seeing themselves well supported, they showed a little more courage, and although exposed to a heavy fire, they maintained their ground with considerable firmness, until the enemy, having gained possession of La Haye-Sainte by putting every one of the garrison to the sword, increased the numbers of the assailants. Under cover of his artillery, Bonaparte caused the right and left columns formerly mentioned, supported by the third column, to move forward and attack the heights on which our division was posted. With drums beating, colours flying, and eagles soaring above their huge headdresses, the enemy advanced in solid column to the attack. Their progress was considerably retarded by the fire of our artillery and volleys of musketry from the Belgian infantry, till the enemy, having almost gained the summit of the ridge, our allies partially retired from the hedge. At the entreaty of their officers, the greater part of them again returned to their posts. But it was merely to satisfy their curiosity, for they almost immediately again retired without firing a shot. The officers exerted themselves to the utmost to keep the men at their duty, but their efforts were fruitless, and at length the whole corps took fairly to their heels. The post thus abandoned by Les Braves Belges was instantly reoccupied by the 3rd Battalion Royals and 2nd Battalion 44th Regiment. Those two weak battalions poured on the assailants a heavy fire of musketry, but the latter continued to advance with unflinching courage till they succeeded in compelling our friends also to retire from the hedge. Everyone was now convinced that our affairs had approached an important crisis, and that an attempt to arrest the torrent must instantly be made, or the heights, and with them the victory, yielded to the enemy. The Belgians had left us. The Royals and 44th had also retired to our rear, and the 42nd Regiment being posted on an important spot considerably to our left, from which they could not move. The hazardous attempt devolved upon the 92nd Regiment, then about 230 strong. On arriving at the hedge, the enemy formed in close column, opposing to us a front not larger than our own. But then they had 10 similar fronts to support the one in view. In fact, their numbers were 3,000, ours 230. Perceiving the urgent state of affairs and the absolute necessity that existed of adopting some decisive measures, Sir Denis Pack said, with much earnestness, 92nd, you must charge. All the troops in your front have given way. To this not very encouraging address, the regiment responded with cheers, and then advanced to measure bayonets with their enemies. For some time, the latter appeared resolved to give us a meeting, but on arriving within 30 paces of them, the whole column, completely panic-struck, wheeled to the right about, and in the utmost confusion attempted to escape. But it was now too late, for on perceiving the disorderly manner in which the French infantry were retiring, Sir William Ponsonby rushed forward with the 1st, 2nd, Scots Greys, and 6th regiments of heavy dragoons, cut his way through them as far as the valley, killed and wounded an immense number, captured 2 eagles, and took 2,000 prisoners. The Scots Greys, being the centre regiment, advanced directly upon the French column and charged past our flanks. On approaching us, the old Greys cried, as with one voice, "Hurrah, 92nd Scotland forever!" The effect produced by these heart-stirring words was astonishing. Anxious to accompany their gallant countrymen into the middle of the fight, many of the 92nd laid hold of the bridles and stirrups of the Greys in order to be in at the death. But the more haste, the less speed was here fully verified. For instead of advancing at an accelerated pace, the poor fellows were thrown down and some of them severely injured. The whole scene was truly grand but affecting, for around and on every side of us the dead, the dying, and the wounded covered the ground. This charge was made about 3 o'clock. I never saw the soldiers of the 92nd Regiment so extremely savage as they were on this occasion. They repeatedly called to the cavalry to give the enemy no quarter. This feeling was produced principally by a report, industriously circulated on the previous day, that the enemy had put to death, in cold blood, all the British and Prussian prisoners who had had the misfortune to fall into their hands. Towards the close of the engagement, however, when the French were more to be pitied than feared, they assumed a very different air and treated the prisoners with the kindness characteristic of the British soldier. The result of this attack must have deranged the plans of Napoleon dreadfully, for an almost total suspension of hostilities on his part took place from 3:15 till about 20 minutes from 4. During this time, our rocket brigade attempted to break the French column of support, while the Scots Greys hovered on its flanks to take advantage of any opening that might occur. But their efforts were fruitless. The enemy remained firm as rocks. Heavy as the cannonade was in the early part of the action, it was trifling in comparison to what followed. The cannonballs were dispatched from the enemy's lines in such numbers that it was no uncommon thing to see one rolling on the ground towards us, and 2 or 3 at the same time flying over our heads or carrying off some of the men in the ranks. Conceiving, no doubt, that one other effort would place Hougoumont in their hands, the enemy, after pouring a terrible shower of shells into it, attempted to carry the courtyard at the point of the bayonet. But in this, as in all their former and subsequent attempts, they were signally beaten. By 4 o'clock, the battle had become general. Our centre was furiously attacked by a great body of French cavalry, principally cuirassiers, supported by artillery and a large force of veteran infantry. The French dragoons were extremely bold, galloping round the squares of British infantry, brandishing their swords, and even challenging some of the British officers to single combat, conduct which appeared to many of us more nearly allied to frenzy than bravery. However, they succeeded in penetrating to the crest of the eminence, but being there met by the 3rd Division and right of the 5th, they were instantly sent back reeling on their reserves. The field of battle now assumed a horrid aspect, many parts of it being so thickly strewed with the mangled corpses of the enemy that it was scarcely possible to walk without treading on them. The wounded were in a most pitiable condition, particularly those who, unable to remove themselves, were kept in constant terror, either of being shot or trod to death. But all their lamentations, their prayers, and their cries for assistance were drowned amidst the clash of arms and the thunder of 500 pieces of cannon, which spread death in every direction and made the ground under our feet actually tremble. Prince Blücher, having agreed to support the Duke of Wellington with his whole army, put 3 corps of it in motion from Wavre at 4 o'clock in the morning of the 18th, 2 of them by the pass of St. Lambert, and the 3rd by Ohain. Knowing that the Prussians were on the march to join us, many a prayer for their speedy appearance was repeated before their cannon began to deal death and destruction to the enemy. About 4, 2 Prussian officers passed in front of us at full gallop, eagerly inquiring for the Duke of Wellington. On delivering their message, they returned by the same route, cheered and cheering all the way. Soon after this, we perceived the French and Prussians engaged. The latter were few in number at first, but as each Prussian battalion arrived, it took part in the battle, so that by 6 o'clock, ample work was carved out for Bonaparte in that direction. Finding himself attacked by the Prussians in a much more serious manner than he had anticipated, Bonaparte caused his right to be reinforced. Between this portion of the French army and the Prussians under General Bülow, a dreadful conflict took place and continued till 7 o'clock, by which time all the Prussians moving by the pass of St. Lambert had arrived at the scene of active operations, and the head of General Ziethen's column, accompanied by Blücher, made its appearance about the same time near Terre-la-Haye. To prevent the junction of the 2 armies, Napoleon threw several considerable bodies of troops towards the extreme left of the Allied army. These columns were attacked with great spirit by Blücher, who, on leaving Ohain, marched directly upon Papelotte, leaving Terre-la-Haye on his right. By this movement, the junction of the 2 armies was effected, and Bonaparte's object completely defeated. Time being now of great moment to Napoleon, he, about 6 o'clock, pushed forward a strong body of cavalry and infantry with orders to establish themselves at Mount St. John. The column advanced under cover of a cannonade of the severest kind. For a few minutes the shot and shell flew over and amongst the troops in the centre in prodigious numbers. Many of the cannon shot, after passing our friends, skipped along the causeway as far as the village of Waterloo, and by coming in contact with some of the poor mutilated soldiers, terminated their own career and that of the wretched sufferers. The French troops having reached the crest of the eminence, a report was instantly spread that they had forced the centre of the British line and were on the point of entering Waterloo. The village being literally filled with wounded at the time, the medical staff exerted themselves to get them sent to a place of safety, but their numbers far exceeded the means of transport placed at the disposal of the chief medical officer. Everywhere there were to be seen soldiers without legs, without arms, and otherwise horribly disfigured, begging to be placed on a wagon, or faintly articulating, "Water, water." Many who could not be accommodated with seats in the wagons fled into the forest of Soigny, where they died or were afterwards found in a state too horrible to describe. The wounded in the wagons, though out of the enemy's reach, suffered severely. The highway was so completely blocked up with baggage, stores of various kinds, and some cannon planted in battery for the defence of the road in case of a reverse, that the wagons crowded with wounded could not proceed. Every minute some new and aggravated version of the first report was circulated by the foreign runaways. The Belgian drivers either fled from their wagons or got intoxicated and became unable to perform their duty. And, to crown the whole, the foreign cavalry in their flight threatened to sabre everyone who would not, or rather could not, let them pass. The whole scene, therefore, was one of such horror, confusion, and apparent danger that in imitation of their brethren at Waterloo, those who could crawl quitted their seats and sought for safety in the wood of Soigny, where many of them also perished. Such were some of the early fruits of the enemy's operations against Mount St. John. The latter may be enumerated in few words. With admirable spirit, the French ascended from the valley to the crest of our position, and for some time seemed quite determined to retain possession of their prize. But their opponents being as fully determined that they should not, a desperate conflict ensued, which ended in the enemy being driven down the slope of the eminence with great slaughter. Never did French troops display more bravery, and never were they more signally defeated. They appeared to us at times to throw aside the character of man and allow their courage to border on the ferocity of the tiger. It was a desperate game, to be sure, which their leader was playing, and it was no doubt his best policy to employ men equally desperate as himself. From the termination of this attack till 7 o'clock, the battle raged with great fury from Hougoumont to the heights on which the left of the Prussian army rested. About the latter hour, Napoleon, in order to bring the conflict to a close, brought forward his guards, in number about 15,000. Placing himself at their head, he accompanied them to the bottom of the valley, but no farther. There he remained to witness the result of this awful and last struggle for victory. Having, soon after the termination of the last detailed attack, received a wound, which compelled me to quit my corps and thereby deprived me of the honour of accompanying my friends in the last offensive movement against the enemy, I am unable to detail from personal observation what occurred in the latter part of the day. But the following particulars, extracted from the notebook of an old and highly valued friend who escaped untouched, will more than supply the deficiency. Under cover of a heavy cannonade, the Imperial Guards who had sworn to conquer or die ascended the heights, the threadbare cry of "Vive l'Empereur" issuing from every mouth. To the issue of this combat, many looked forward with emotion. The causes of their despondency were the superiority of the enemy and the very few British troops in the field. But although not a few despaired of victory, I am confident that not a man thought of retreating, so long as one companion remained to stand by him. The advance of the Imperial Guards was covered by a cloud of sharpshooters whose fire caused us considerable loss. As the enemy approached the crest of the height, the sharpshooters were recalled to their battalions and the fire of their artillery slackened. In a few seconds thereafter, the belligerents found themselves opposed to each other at the distance of 20 paces, and instantly proceeded to decide the important contest. From that time till 7:30, the battle raged with violence at every point, and the victory was doubtful. Soon after this, however, some little hesitation was observed in the enemy's movements, and the gallant Blucher advanced, spreading death and dismay over the field on the left of the British. The Duke, taking advantage of the favourable opportunity now offered, ordered the whole Allied army to advance. The charge proving irresistible, the enemy fled in confusion and were very roughly handled by our cavalry and artillery. The carnage was dreadful. In many places the enemy lay in heaps, their squares of infantry suffered tremendously from our artillery, and the numerous mangled corpses which strewed the field showed, from the nature of their wounds, that our cavalry had done their duty. After a desperate resistance, the enemy were finally driven past La Belle Alliance, a little in front of which we came in contact with the Prussians, who halted and played our national air of God Save the King. Here it was also where the two illustrious commanders first met after the battle and congratulated each other on the successful termination of their joint labours. That concludes the 18th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.